Well, welcome to Hardin-Simmons University. I'm excited to see all the bright, shiny faces. Let me say, there's two things that I was told about coming to West Texas that you don't complain about: high gas prices and rain. But I'm going to tell you, I am tired of the rain, and I'm so glad the sun has come out. It's so beautiful, and the grass is green, the trees are happy, and Gilbert's happy by the pond. So the mission of Hardin-Simmons University is to be a community dedicated to excellence in education, enlightened by Christian faith and values. And I hope today, as we experience life together, that you get to experience our faith and values in action by our hospitality. So we're glad you're here. Make sure you get plenty of water and food and drinks and stuff, and just sit down and enjoy what's, oh, they're taking a selfie. There we go. Good. I just called you out. Good. I do want to say this, and I want to share my appreciation for those who serve in our political process and those who serve in the press. Each and every day, folks carry a heavy burden and do work for us to provide us what we have today. And I'm grateful. I know we're grateful. Can we give our folks a round of applause for the work that they do? Thank you. Specifically, I want to thank Representative Stan Lambert, also Representative Drew Springer, and Texas Tribune reporter Alana Rocha for their work today. And I'm going to get out of the way so they can hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you, President. The microphone would help. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thank you for coming to this event. Again, I'm Alana Rocha. I'm the multimedia reporter at the Texas Tribune. I've been there since 2012 and have had an opportunity to work with these gentlemen in the legislature. I want to thank Hardin-Simmons University as well for hosting this event, and a huge thank you to James Stone for helping organize this event. I also want to thank the following sponsors: Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, Independent Colleges and Universities of Texas, Inc., Pearson, AT&T, PepsiCo, Walmart, Southwest Airlines, the official airline of Texas Tribune events, and the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning. For those of you unfamiliar, the Texas Tribune is a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news organization. We cover statewide politics and policy issues in Texas, and we're supported by members like you. And to become a Texas Tribune member or to learn more about what we do, please visit us at texastribune.org. With that, I will remind you to silence your cell phones if you don't mind. And if you are tweeting this event, we ask that you use the hashtag #TTEvents. The event will last until 1 o'clock. It'll be about 45 minutes of moderated conversation by myself, and then we'll open the last 15 to 20 to audience questions. You see a couple mics up here at the front. I'll give you a 5-minute warning if you guys want to start lining up. With that, I will introduce our panelist. One moment. Seated next to me is State Representative Stan Lambert, the people of District 71 here, first elected Mr. Lambert in 2016 to represent them in the State House. Representative Lambert came to the Capitol with years of experience in community banking and public service. He served as the mayor of Ennis, Texas, as a member of the Abilene School District Board of Trustees, and as athletic director at his undergraduate alma mater, Abilene Christian University. In the legislature, Representative Lambert sits on the House Energy Resources Committee, Defense and Veterans Affairs, and the Texas Sunset Advisory Committee. He's on the ballot this cycle and faces Democrat Sam Hatton. Welcome.
Thank you.
Seated next to him is State Representative Drew Springer. He served the people of State House District 68, the 22 counties just north of here, since 2013. He graduated with an accounting degree from the University of North Texas, spent 15 years working his way up to president of a Texas railway company, and then left that job to join his father's financial services business, where he specializes in agricultural managed futures. And for the past 10 years, he served as a volunteer firefighter. Among his committee assignments, Representative Springer serves as Vice Chair of County Affairs and sits on the Ways and Means and Redistricting committees. He is running unopposed to serve another term in the legislature. Let's have a round of applause for both gentlemen. Well, let's start with elections. We don't know exactly who's going to be back or who will be new in the legislature, in the House or Senate. And the first day you're back, you'll have to elect the new speaker. Last count was 7 people so far have filed, 6 Republicans, 1 Democrat. Representative Springer, I know you signed the pledge to support whoever the caucus supports. Did you also sign that pledge?
I did not sign the pledge.
Can I ask why not?
Well, I just feel like that's a decision that I wanted to make after seeing all the candidates once they announced and formalized their candidacy and began to move around the state, answering questions and being vetted to some degree. And so the decision for me was just to wait and see who all was going to be involved. And until then, I wanted to make sure that I had all the names in front of me.
For people who aren't familiar, what is the pledge exactly, Representative Springer?
Sure, what the pledge is. And so the Republican caucus met and voted unanimously, and Stan did vote on that, that says we're going to have this process where we will have all of the candidates come forward, and to get the endorsement of the caucus, you have to get 65% of the votes on the first or 60% if there's multiple rounds of voting. I don't believe that we would see anybody from the far right or far left side of the caucus, somebody who wouldn't work with Democrats, be selected, that'll get 60%. Almost every single Republican I talk to says, thank God we're in Austin and not in Washington. We work with the Democrats on the other side. I was telling a young gentleman here, Pancho Navarez at Eagle Pass, I work probably the closest with. He has 35,000 square miles. I have 25,000 square miles. Combined, we represent over 20% of the state of Texas between two of us. And so I felt comfortable in saying, this is the way that process should be. Here's where we should go from it, and we should decide in our caucus who that speaker is going to be.
So it doesn't send a negative message to Democrats coming in?
I think it was just a fearful message, hopefully not too negative. I mean, anytime you change and it's a different process, you're going to be worried about that. But if we get to that process of December 1 and a speaker hasn't caught fire and basically won it, as in the past, without that, I think that those questions will start coming out then, is how you're going to work on that. Do you have Democrats as chairman? And nobody has suggested that I've heard anywhere that we should go like so many other states, which only the majority party gets to have those chairmanship, because we do work. About 90% of things are nonpartisan. Defense and Veterans Affairs. I mean, that's absolutely one from that standpoint. County Affairs. I work very closely with Garnett Coleman, a Democrat out of Houston. We work on indigent defense, jail standards, those kind of things, and it's important work.
Representative Lambert, you served just one term under Speaker Strauss. What are you looking for in the next speaker? Speaker Strauss was criticized by, blockading or, serving as a roadblock, if you will, of a lot of conservative issues that didn't go anywhere last session that the Senate had passed. Are you looking for somebody with a different approach in the next speaker?
I don't know if you would say it's a different approach, but I think it's going to be somebody that certainly is going to move closer towards a body-driven House that would be open and fair-minded, who would be a servant leader in many respects, somebody that we're going to be working with very closely. I think Speaker Strauss attempted and wanted to do many of those kinds of things and reflect those kinds of characteristics. I think there were some other things coming along that may have prevented him from doing some of those things. But I think we'll be best served if we have a speaker who is representative of the body, who understands that the body is responsible for bringing forth good legislation, having good debate, good dialogue on a number of different issues, even involving the far left, far right. So I think they're going to be somebody that's open-minded, somebody that's fair-minded, and will move forward in that direction. So I think we've got 6 excellent candidates from the Republican side, and I think certainly one of those gentlemen would be a great fit for that position.
Of course, we start this conversation with a vote that stays at the Capitol. The people and your constituents don't directly vote for Speaker. Have you heard any of that on the trail? I mean, are people aware of the fact that the Speaker, there'll be a new one for the first time in several years?
They are in my town hall, so I probably have done 30, 40 town halls already this interim. They're not familiar with really who is running. They're asking that question. They are more familiar with the changes we made in caucus. And I get very positive feedback from my constituents that we're going to have that vote in caucus. And it's a non-binding. I mean, at the end of the day, it's unconstitutional for us to bind in a caucus, and so, and that's, I think, the reason we did the additional pledge on top of it to see where we stood. But they do see that change. They want to know that we're selecting somebody that's going to let members represent their district. I'm a very different district than so many. I mean, the rural Texas is declining in population. I hate to say there's 1,000 people a day moving to Texas, but there's 1,200 people a day moving to Austin, Dallas, and Houston, and they're leaving rural Texas. I mean, my district's the same exact size. We'll redistrict, not at 165,000, but about 203,000 people. But finding somebody that lets us rural health care, rural education, make sure we maintain our roads. We don't have congestion problems. So anybody's watching online, if you're stuck in traffic and hate it, come out. We have great internet out here in rural Texas, and you can work from out here. So.
No, that's true. My only traffic yesterday on the way up was in Austin. So, well, you talk about all these needs out here and needs across the state, urban and rural, and a lot of that money, of course, comes from property taxes, an effort that fell short last session on those final days because of stark differences between the House and Senate. That issue again will come up, hearing from leadership. You have an interesting perspective, Representative Lambert, coming from a local government background. You know the other side of it. What do you see as far as the state's role in regulating a tax that it doesn't directly issue?
Well, if your question is really about revenue caps, I'll tell you that my preference is that if we do go that direction, that we give our local legislators, our local county officials, our local city officials a commitment to stop passing unfunded mandates. And that as the state moves forward, whatever policies, whatever issues may be coming forward, that those don't materialize into additional cost that our counties and our cities and school districts and school boards are having to somehow muster the funds or reprioritize or do something necessary to generate those funds to cover those costs. And I think that's the argument against revenue caps. We got hung up on whether it was 6% or 4%, and now we're seeing our governor coming out with a 2.5% revenue cap. That, in a perfect environment, that may sound like it works pretty well. But I can tell you that there are certain times when you can't anticipate some cost that didn't come up. It may be in Jones County right now. We've got a major trial going on that's costing them quite a bit of money. So I just don't think that it's fair to talk about caps unless we're also willing to talk about making sure that we don't pass unfunded mandates.
Some Republicans, your Republican counterparts, believe that the best tax relief is just putting more state dollars into public education. Is that a viable way to alleviate our tax burden at the local level?
It definitely is. I mean, everything we talked about last session was not tax relief. It was tax reform and slowing growth. It was not going to cut anything. There are numerous policies and bills being looked at. I've got one that will look at buying down the M&O rate from anywhere from a nickel all the way to 100%, eliminating the M&O property tax. And that way the state would pay 100% of our M&O for the schools. I think we do need to get back in balance in that, and I think we'll look at different mechanisms to accomplish that. At times we have to adjust. We've seen huge growth with no signs that we're about to see a bubble to where property values are going to be dropping. When I talk to my rural counties, the biggest challenge we have is we're at $49 for oil on January 1. Today we're in the 70s. And so, we're about to see, again, appraisals go up or values go up again, and so that'll generate more property tax. We have the ability to be able to buy that down, and we should look at it. On the revenue cap side of things, though, it is not a hard cap. It's just one that says today you already have a revenue cap. You've got an 8% cap today. If you go beyond the 8%, citizens have to petition their government to say, we think you've gone too far. It was 5% until the late 70s when inflation came up. We're talking somewhere in that range and going back. But we've asked the voters. We asked them in March. 90% of the voters in Stan in my district plus said we want a 4%, and we don't want to have to do a petition. And so I think the voters have spoken pretty loudly on that. But we have to craft intelligent legislation, like Stan mentioned, with the unfunded mandates. And some things we can do. I'm working on the indigent defense. Hey, that is escalated much greater than population inflation. We need to figure out how to get that down, because that is driving up property taxes at the local level. The fact that we don't have enough mental health beds means we are leaving people in county jails too long, and that costs county taxpayers. And that's not fair. We need to step up and address those things as well.
What are you finding, any possible bills already in the works as far as your role on Ways and Means and what's being discussed there?
You know, on the Ways and Means side, yeah, I mean, it's there's several. Some are addressing the reform. Some are looking at different buy downs that goes more to consumption. But we've seen this argument since I've ran in 2012. Hey, we want to eliminate property taxes and go to consumption tax. That sounds fantastic. Okay, but somebody has to lay the details out and say, what does that look like? And we may have an intelligent conversation and debate it vigorously to say this is maybe bad for the economy if we go this direction. And we may come back and say, you know, the property tax system, while it's not the world's greatest, it's better than anything we might change. Mm-hmm. I think we can definitely find some things, though, to change and buy that down.
What about on school finance? That was obviously an issue. It's pretty much an issue, I feel like, every session. And there you see a real divide. It's not partisan necessarily, but it's rural, urban, and you're always going to disappoint somebody. Will that ever be adequately or fairly reworked?
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
House Bill 21 passed the House 140 something to 3 or 4. I'm not sure who voted against it, but there were a couple. House Bill 21 was a great first start, but it basically came back completely annihilated, all the funding stripped out with a voucher component. And then there wasn't really an effort to try to conference together and try to find some common ground. And I think that's where the next speaker hopefully will take the leadership position of saying, look, we can sit down and we can roll our sleeves up and we can try to solve this. It won't get solved in one session. It'll take multiple sessions because it's a very complex, it's a very convoluted way in which the Robin Hood plan was put in 30 years ago. No one anticipated the kind of property rate growth that we would have, you know, in the last 10 years. But that's something that I think that we've got to address, and we've got to find ways. Now, we've said all along that we don't want a personal income tax. We don't want a business income tax. I think that's fueling the Texas miracle. That's why we've got people moving to Texas at the high rate we have, because we have a great economy. We've got the lowest unemployment rate ever in the history of the state, or at least in the last 40 or 50 years. So we don't want to do things necessarily that are going to change the fact that our economy is going well. We've got jobs available. We've got things that are moving in the right direction. But we've got to try to get our hands and arms around school finance, and I think it's time that we prioritize education to the level it has needed to be for the last several years.
What about revising how commercial properties are appraised? I know that's been talked about for a few sessions as far as finding the money to kind of plug the holes, if you will, and just a fair appraisal process for commercial properties.
You know, that is a total misnomer. The gentleman running for lieutenant governor doesn't understand that that does not put more money into education. What it does is relieves the homeowners' tax burden, because there is a dollar amount that says, here's the county budget. If we appraised commercial real estate at a higher level, you still have the same county budget. It just changes the percentage and the tax rates that people would pay at a different amount. And so you'd have more values. And so those don't roll in. The state sets what each kid is going to get based on ADA or WADA or all the different terms we use. And those additional funds, if you had taxed commercial property more, that would just mean the state of Texas would put a lower percentage in to match what would go into education. So that doesn't fix education from that aspect. Now, it would generate more money. Could you potentially do it? But that, once again, is left to the legislature to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember speaking with Senator Betancourt, a Republican in the Senate, about this, who comes from a appraisal background, and just saying it needs to be reined in. So not maybe to address education, but as far as property taxes and making sure everybody's paying their fair portion.
Well, and that was what one of the aspects of the property tax reform bill was, dealt with appraisal districts and making sure all property was being appraised fairly in that regards. And we will continue to work on that. I carried a bill that dealt with dark store values, where there was an avenue that was being utilized, but it's gone through the courts. It looks like it's coming back to a more value based on what it's probably worth than where it had gone. It's not a perfect world, but you see these ups and downs in the balances between them.
Another issue we're going to see, we've seen a lot of work in the interim, especially since May when there was the deadly shooting at the Santa Fe High School, is school safety and how that looks in rural Texas here, given the coverage areas you represent. Representative Lambert, what do you see as the solution? You know, we've seen the governor's plan, 40-point plan. We've seen the Senate Select Committee look at this. A lot of it is focusing on mental health resources and beefing up counselor roles and things like that. How do you see it playing out in your district?
I think we'll see a combination of those things move forward in terms of proposed legislation. I don't think there's a one size fits all. Certainly the difference between rural and urban is a major factor in how school districts probably would address the issue of improving and making their campuses more secure. I know at first there was a lot of discussion about the hardening of campuses as far as entrances and exits and metal detectors and that sort of thing. But I think the discussion has moved past that now and is really talking about the mental health issues and the counseling positions and making sure that that our students there are relationships that are built so that we can identify and that we can help prevent or at least get them the help they need if they become isolated, if they've been bullied, if there's problems going on at home, whatever those situations that might create a situation where they might feel isolated to some degree, then we can get them the help that they need. So, you know, in rural Texas out here, it may take 15, 20 minutes for first responders to respond to an active shooter on a campus. So we've got to look at other ways. School marshal program, I think, is something that certainly in rural areas we've certainly want to continue to look to and emphasize and provide resources to help those school districts do that. So I think it's something we need to address. It's something that's going to come up early in the session, and we'll see various forms of legislation to address it.
Yeah, and I think to follow Stan said exactly the one thing is one size does not fit all. So Harold ISD was the first school to have guns on campus well over a decade ago because they're that 20 minutes away from Vernon. You know, I've got 72 school districts. Almost half of them now have guns on campus programs. We need to make sure that they have the flexibility to work for those small ones. And I've told everybody, if we come up with a solution that works for Houston ISD and we implement that statewide, we will see a vast amount of closures in rural school districts because we won't be able to do the same things. And that's not what our folks want to see. And so we need to do that. The mental health is huge. Texas Tech did a fantastic job with their Twitter program. 10 school districts used it. 40,000 kids had a level that said we need to move to the next level to figure out where they are psychologically. Worked through the steps. 200 people actually had to go see a psychiatrist. 25 of them had a gun on them. You know, those type of things, Sandy Hook Promise, a lot of the school districts around the state are using that. Very similar type of deal. That is that identifying the kids that are struggling. I asked my guys in Graham, Texas, would we have had the NFA type of deal? And one of their comments was, you know, we can't be afraid of telling our kids there's boundaries. And we had kids wearing dusters to school. We tell them, no, you go put them in the principal's office. At the end of the day, you can come pick them up. After they do it twice, they quit wearing those kind of things. We can't be afraid to tell kids there are boundaries that they've got to stay within.
Is it partly, though, an absence of the counselor's role? I did a mental health event a couple years ago, and afterwards, some school counselors came up to me and said, you made no mention of the school counselor because, you know, we talked about mental health first aid and training teachers, you know, to spot the warning signs. Oftentimes, our guidance counselors, who are masters, you know, educated, are administering tests instead of talking to students. Is there maybe something the state can do to revamp that role or define it back to how it originally was defined?
I think so, and I think that's where local districts would have to be more assertive, at least in redefining what that role is for their particular area. But I certainly think the state can give them some incentives or some things to look at to try to look at those positions. It has evolved or morphed into more of a academic role in terms of just the test results and administering the test and then where does that lead us to in terms of pre-college or workforce or whatever that may be? But absolutely, do I think that we can give our counselors additional training, but we need to pay for it. We need to be able to provide the funding to do that.
And I think that's one of the things that a formalized program, either the two I mentioned or whatever it is. And I also will say this: if we roll this out, the state needs to cover that cost. To be able to do that, we've already got enough funds tied up in tight school district budgets to be able to do that. I think both those will highlight that school counselor in making sure that they are available at those times, and that is the top priority, not administering a test.
Let's talk about the budget. Will there be money to put into new programs like this, given all the, again, holes you have to plug in the budget? Now, adding to that Hurricane Harvey on top of different things that weren't funded in the last budget?
I think there will. I mean, one, we've been blessed, as I was talking about oil and gas earlier, we're going to see another $2.7 billion this budget cycle come in that we did not project, and it's because of the oil and gas. That helps us fill one of our two holes that we left behind that were very big. One was in Medicaid funding, and the other one was in transportation. So we will have the funds to be able to do that. Because oil and gas is doing well, we will come back with almost $12 billion in the rainy day fund. So we will have that. And people think that it's a bright, shiny object we never touch. People don't realize we took $1 billion out of the rainy day fund last session to deal with deals. And we know we will have a demand. Those folks that suffered under Hurricane Harvey, we've got to figure out where's the right level that the state steps in doing that. I tell my constituents who are, hundreds of miles away from the coast, says, look, if they built a $100 million school and it's wiped off and insurance is only going to pay $95 million, they've already got bonds out for that. Should the state pick up the $5 million deductible? And I said, absolutely. That is what the role of that should be, is to be able to, and I have no problems, as a fiscal conservative, saying use it.
I think one of the examples, too, of the last session was the reprioritization of funding for CPS reform, for mental health resources, the additional funding that we put in there. That came as a result of, as you may recall, the governor asking for agency heads to provide budgets based on about a 4 to 6% budget cut. I don't hear that right now, at least. I think agency heads are being asked to look at 2%, maybe 6%. They always kind of do a 10% cut, but that's just kind of a worst case scenario. So will we see some agencies maybe making some cuts possibly to help us reprioritize? I think in a $217 billion budget biennium, we can find the money to help schools become safe. And I think that's a priority, that we've got to fulfill that promise and make sure that we fulfill that obligation.
Speaking of schools, we're of course on a university campus. A lot of talk last session about reining in tuition cost and just how much those have skyrocketed. Do you think that will again come up? Do you expect that to come up again in the coming session?
Yeah, it will definitely come up. It is becoming less and less of a priority for discussions. If we talk about property tax cuts and so many other things, we know that our universities are focused on trying to keep that growth as low as possible. Higher ed will discuss it, make sure if they think it's reasonable. I don't think we'll see any changes to it, though.
You don't think there'll be the political bandwidth to address that? I
don't see it this session coming up. Well, one in my district it doesn't even hit the radar as an issue. I mean, yes, does the cost of education come up? Absolutely, it comes up. But in this economy where jobs are plentiful, you can you can go to a community college in my district, get a 2-year associate's degree in cybersecurity, and you'll have a job for the next 20 years with negative unemployment predicted, starting at $65,000 a year. There are good paying jobs, and so that has been more the focus. How do we keep those going and dealing with some of these other ones more so?
But where we've had cuts in the past, I do think we need to go back and take a look at some of those and just see where it impacted the most, where we can possibly come back and do some damage repair, at least to some degree. It may not fully restore the funding that they had maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but at least try to provide some of the additional funds. TEG funding is very important for private liberal arts universities like the one we're here at with Hardin-Simmons. We've got 2 other private universities here in my district. So that kind of funding is very important for students to be able to keep the costs down It's basically a savings for the state, because if those students were to enroll in public universities, the cost is 2 or 3 times as much. So tuition equalization grants are something that I'm very interested in, and I know Representative Springer is as well. But all in all, as the ebb and flow goes of the economy, then there are certain times in which you do make cuts, but there's also times when you can try to restore some of those cuts.
One area of focus for you, and speaking with you prior and just observing last session, Representative Springer, is addressing ADA compliance, Americans with Disability Act. Talk a little bit about that and your personal tie to that, and what you see as frustrations that the state can maybe address.
No, sure. I mean, there's numerous. I mean, we're talking about a law that's been enacted almost 25 plus years ago that still isn't today meeting the standards that it needs to meet. It came up last session. TxDOT has a plan that by 2052 they'll finally be in compliance. I mean, with a law that means, for 60 plus years, and if we weren't a state government, we could be sued for it. But at the same time, we see our cities continue to give certificate of occupancies to businesses where a business has hired an architect, hired a general contractor, has the city looking over it, wants to do all the right things, and they build something that's out of compliance. The city needs to be a partner in that game, and they need to come back and say, look, we're not going to give a certificate of occupancy if you don't match that. And that would be a go forward. And we're not talking about going back and redoing that. We do have mechanisms, and we need to do a better job of letting those, when they get their handicap placard, know that if you find a restaurant, that says, look, we just we don't provide handicap restrooms, nothing with accessibility. Here's the state agency that you can file the complaint, and we will send an inspector out to look at it. So we have to be able to press those for those that are challenges. They need to be part of our society. They need to be able to go everywhere it is. And yeah, it's a passionate one for me with a wife who's been in a wheelchair for 29 years. It was one of the reasons I was very passionate about the stem cell bill that we passed to give that right to try, which we did for cancer patients as well. The last session before that, there's huge promises, both spinal cord injuries, MS, Parkinson's, all sorts of different things. But we force Americans to fly out of the country to go to receive that, and so only the wealthy get it. The wealthy have seen huge benefits from doing that, but we don't allow it to be done in the U.S. because we let some of our medical, health, and human service type of issues stand in that way, and we need to fight those.
Well, that was an emotional speech, personal privilege. You were up against a midnight deadline, just trying to get that bill kind of initially authorized. And you said you plan to file more, or at least working with Tan Parker, try to file even more measures on stem cells?
Well, one of the things you do when you put a bill out like that is you can never anticipate everything through. The good thing is both the agencies have worked very well with us to come up with the rulemaking. We should see treatment starting here before the end of the year, and we'll find out if there's some tweaks to that bill that we need to do. It appears that maybe it needs to be around advertising. The one thing that Tan and I were very adamant about is we don't want to see snake oil salesmen taking advantage of people that are in desperate situations from life. If somebody promises, if you'll give me $20,000, I'll make you be able to walk again out of a wheelchair, there's not many people that wouldn't do that. And we need to make sure, though, that people are doing truth in advertising, making sure they're not over-promising.
That the protections are there.
That's correct.
Is there controversial, talking about stem cells as living organisms, and there's been some debate on the ethical use of them given the life issue and things like that. Do you parse that out?
On this, it was definitely probably one of the biggest misconceptions, because when stem cell, the ideas and thoughts of it all started with embryonic stem cells, but we're only talking adult stem cells. And so I appreciate you saying that, because everybody needs to understand we are only talking about as adult stem cells. It can be fat extracted from your body and spun up, grown, and re-put back into you. It can be taken from umbilical cords. And so it has nothing to do with that debate that is always one of those tough ones at the state capitol, which is, pro-life versus pro-choice.
Just another good example of how some other representatives were able to kind of give up their point in the process, in the order of how bills were going to be heard that night. to make sure that that bill did get heard before the midnight hour. So it was just another example of how we can work together as a body, both sides, urban, rural, Democrats, Republicans, to resolve important issues, important questions that are coming before us.
Still, as a freshman, what were your observations of the session that you didn't know? I mean, it was wonderful that night, bipartisan, but not throughout the whole session. It always is tense. People are tired at the end of session. What were your takeaways as a freshman?
You know, without having anything to compare it to, I would just say it was a little bit. Everyone says that every session has a tone, it has a rhythm, a sycophancy. I mean, it just kind of has a certain tune. This one everyone said, was a little bit different than the couple of before. So I would just say that I just think in terms of making sure we understood. I'm kind of coming from a sports background, and so I'm going to tell you that I think every coach would start a game with not just an offensive plan, but a defensive plan. And I think there were times in which we were dealing with certain issues, different times during the session when we were kind of looking at, are we on the defense or are we on the offense? And I think that was something that was a little bit missing in terms of the leadership and communication with all the members in terms of what our priorities were in terms of the House and where we were headed. I think we were hearing a lot from the other side as far as where the Senate was going with certain types of bills and legislation, but it seemed like we were just playing defense a lot, and instead of having a very overall game plan with an offensive strategy. And I think that was something that kind of caught me a little bit off guard, that we weren't better prepared for that.
Representative Springer, this being what, your fourth session?
Finishing up third, going into number 4.
Okay. How did you measure last session compared to the rest?
You know, each one of them definitely had their unique, different styles coming in. You know, this last one, there was clearly tension between the Senate and the House. And to Stan's point is, we've got to be able to work together, and that's really member to member, and that's members with other members across the rotunda. I think we want to see much more member-driven from the House. I think that's what we're looking for in our next speakers is that member-driven rather than, from a top-down as much. And then we need to reach across. I need to work. I mean, I have a great relationship with Charles Perry. We've talked about our property tax bills and coming through those. We need to have, one of the problems is we haven't had interim committee hearings jointly with the House and Senate members where the members are working on solutions rather than being told what we think the answer is. And I think we will come up with those if we work that direction. And so, that was the real challenge in there.
One of the benefits of being on Sunset is just getting an opportunity to get to know the other side, to get to know some of the senators on a more personal level. And I think that's been one of the blessings, one of the benefits I've received just in the last 9 months. So I think I agree with Representative Springer. We've got to do a better job of reaching out, and making sure that those relationships have a good, solid foundation so we can find ways to work together on these important issues. If not, we're going to lose another 2 years of kicking the can.
What about your experience on Veterans Affairs and the fact that there's an Air Force base just up the road, and in a couple of years maybe another potential base realignment, and where bases and military installations could close as a result of that? The governor has put several $1 million into making sure that these bases are not vulnerable. What sort of talk ahead of next session is there about a potential BRAC process?
I think it's coming. We know it's coming. I think originally it was projected to start in 2021, but I think that's even been moved up to maybe 2020. So it's going to occur after the next legislative session. So we've got one session basically to make sure that we are in the best possible position statewide, locally as well, to defend the operations, the missions of our men and women who wear the uniform, who do such a tremendous job. We're a large state, and we've got a number of different military installations, and that's good and bad. In the terms of the good, it's a tremendous economic benefit to the state in terms of billions of dollars of economic impact, but it also puts a target on our back. And we know that other states are kind of looking at Texas and saying, if we're going to close bases, our military installations, maybe Texas needs to give one up. So it's important for us to do everything we possibly can in terms of making sure that our local Air Force bases deal with encroachment issues, that we make sure that some of the grants that are available through the governor's office get used in terms of making improvements and enhancements and giving us every possible tool in our toolbox to make sure that the next BRAC process doesn't impact Texas in a negative way. So we'll continue to look for ways on the Defense Committee as well as throughout the entire legislature to make sure that we maintain our strong relationship with our armed forces and continue that great relationship that we have.
Have you seen communities applying for those grants and using them to boost infrastructure or whatever they need to do?
Absolutely. Right here in our backyard, we did get a grant approved, about $200,000 something, I think, to improve some perimeter fencing around Dice Air Force Base just in the last couple of years. So, yes, absolutely, those grants are being utilized as much as possible.
We have about 20 minutes. I'll give you like a 5-minute warning if you guys want to line up and to ask some questions of the representatives. What are you hoping for in the next session as far as, priorities go? We've kind of talked about some of the areas you plan to focus on, but what are you hoping is different, from last session as far as takeaways or things you really hope to accomplish? Of course, the system is designed to kill bills, so it normally takes 2 or 3 sessions to get a measure through. Any that you've been trying for a couple times that you hope it finally gets across the finish line?
We talked about the ADA, and I think that's one of those multiple ones you file, and you keep moving that forward until it gets enough traction. But the big one I am focused on is on the property tax, reducing that M&O to bring that balance back in. To do that, I will say I was maybe the eager guy early on, and so I filed about 60 bills each session, and I'm tired of being the one known of carrying the record for the most, and I'm trying to figure out how can I get down to about 5 or 10 bills and really just sort of focus on those. But at the same time, with 22 counties, there's a lot of local issues. I mean, it's as simple as Hall County has a hunting issue on a river that we've addressed on most of the other places in the state. Nobody's going to care, but those are important things to 1,500 citizens of Hall County. And so, we'll continue to tackle those. So, yes, focus on the big issue. For me, it's property tax. I look forward to hearing what we come back on the school finance and some of the other things and making sure my rural schools are protected in those. But it's also making sure we do the right things for our district. And it is that balance of being able to do those things.
Absolutely. School finance, I think, is my number one priority. I just think that we've got to get started on a program that tries to simplify a very complex funding formula and really get down to some basics. We've got to redefine maybe the cost of education index, try to find ways in which we can remove all these Band-Aids that we've placed on school finance over the last 20, 25 years. I think the other thing that I would just say, though, is we've got to create an atmosphere within our body that members can work together with members and find commonality. Representative Springer brought up the fact that we don't want to be like Washington. We don't want to be so polarized that we can't sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about issues and have a decent dialogue. We still may agree to disagree, but the vitriol and just getting the acrimonious language out of some of our discussions, we've got to do a better job of that. I don't think we're doing a bad job, but I just think we've got to make sure we don't let that infiltrate even further than maybe what it did in the last session. So just creating an atmosphere of working together. We can be much stronger as a team and as a body of 150. And then when you add the 31 senators involved, we can get some great things done for the state. So it's just a matter of pushing forward, making sure that we fulfill the promises that we've made to our constituents, that we're going to go down to Austin, we're going to get some things done.
Does the presence of the Freedom Caucus within your party complicate those bipartisan efforts?
Yes and no. I mean, anytime if everybody was just right there with Stan and I, it would be really easy to get everything done, exactly what Stan and I want to get done. But, it is good to know where certain ends are and different ideas, and I think we gain from those, and nobody gets 100% of what they want. So it's not bad having a view of especially extreme limited amounts of government, and maybe we have overstepped in sometimes. So there are definitely some advantages of having them in there. You hope that the next speaker figures out how to be able to let them play more in the process, work more in the process, to where they feel like they're adding value, and that the only way they can't get their message across is to have to try to tear down things as they go on. They're a great bunch of guys. I know them well. Most of them came in with me, and so they need to be given the chance to serve their districts and represent their views as well.
With that, we'll open it up to questions. Does anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
Robert McBride, Veteran Service Officer in Nolan County, Texas. Since 2010, I've been a Veteran County Service Officer and have received excellent training from the Texas Veterans Commission. Usually consists of about 4 solid days of training presented by folks like the law firm that won the Niemer decision for the Agent Orange decisions over there, actual decision makers from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs presenting as classes, and getting together with our peers at some place in the state of Texas and exchanging ideas and best practices. This year, our training degraded to what amounted to 4 hours of training on the internet spread out over a course of 3 days because of some of the stuff come out of the Sunset Commission. I'd like to know what the legislature is going to do to make sure that we continue as county service officers, especially out here in the rural areas where our resources are far and few between, to continue to give good training to guys like me. I'm going to be fine. I've been doing it a while. The guys coming behind me may not. To untangle that twisted bag of snakes that the VA is.
You want me to address that? Sure. Robert, good to see you, and thank you for coming, and thank you for your service and for what you do in Nolan County for our veterans. Balance, I think, is the answer. We've got to find a delicate balance between utilizing the technology, the online training, but not completely giving up on the fact that networking and being relational in understanding how you guys do your job, other parts of the state, what may be working, what may not be working. I think we've got to find a balance there where we're not completely taking away the training that benefits those people, like you said, that are kind of coming up in the system now and need mentoring and need others who have kind of worked through some of these things. And that's what I hear the most is the fact that you can get together on a regular basis and still learn kind of where some shortcuts are, because I know how much paperwork's involved. I know how much compliance issues are involved in helping veterans get the services and the programs they need. So I'm about balance, and I know the Sunset has kind of taken a position on that. I want to see us make sure that we don't leave out either one, because I think it's important that we do offer the online services as well, but at the same time we don't give up completely on the fact that there's a lot of benefit from relationship building and networking. So
yeah, I just heard about that last month. One of mine came up to me, and first time I'd heard of it, and it really is, it's the relationship side of that, and it's finding that mix of, okay, instead of going completely against, is there a time where we say, okay, it's every other year, and we've got to work with that and hear from you guys. And it was great that I had a gentleman in your spot in Monte County come out and say at a town hall and bring that to my attention. And so exactly, and so same type of thing. His was not like, hey, the training's fine, but we need to have that interaction to be able to especially for the new guys to come in, so they figure out the old hands they can call and lean on. And that's why corporations have functions where everybody gets together. It's a networking with your peers as much as anything, because it adds value into to being a more effective servant for those who have served us.
Keep in mind too, Sunset's ultimate objective is to try to create recommendations that improve efficiencies in state government. And just kind of piggyback on what you're talking about, as you know, just recently we listened to a recommendation to close 87 rural DPS offices. And we said, no, that's not in the best interests of all Texans around the state. So sometimes things look good on paper. We've got to see what really the practicality and what the reality is. But I hear your point of view, and I understand where you're coming from. So we'll keep working on the training issue.
What does that look like? Will that be a bill, or is it just something modified within the Sunset process?
It'll be modified in the Sunset process. It was already voted on by the 12-member commission to not accept that recommendation on the DPS offices. But as far as the veteran service offices, I think that's something that we can take up in legislation once we meet in January.
Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm John Davis. I teach here at Hardin Simmons. Thank you, all of you, for coming and participating in this. The effort to farm out, contract out essential CPS functions is a mistake. We wouldn't farm out, we wouldn't contract out police, we wouldn't contract out fire. We just do that because that's an essential function of government. So the efforts to farm it out essential CPS functions are a mistake, in my opinion. Could you tell us where you stand on that?
Sure. I mean, I agree. I think sometimes we overdo, hey, let's privatize everything. There are certain things that just are meant to be done by government, and I'm not afraid to say that that's not the best case. I will say on the CPS, and I was thinking of when you were talking about the base closings in this, it reminds me, you know, there's 150 of us, and we all don't know every single issue, and some of it we know at 30,000 feet. If you ask me about CPS, I'll be on the phone with James Frank out of Wichita Falls, who did fantastic work. Somebody I trust and I lean on him. And when we talk about the bills that came up with CPS, I just go, James, is this good for our district and is this good for the state? And so I trust him. When we do property tax in certain ones, he's looking at me. If it's talking about ADA or some of those type of things. So you find those. It's talking to Stan about the defense type of things and what do we do there? You know, I would lean on him and Roland Gutierrez out of San Antonio and those kind of deals. And so, I mean, I will take that back and ask James, have we gone too far? Did we not address this in those? It's one that CPS will constantly have to be tweaked. It's falling over into indigent defense. I mean, it's one of the cost drivers that is costing our counties more. People would be shocked to find out if most of those cases have 6 to 10 lawyers in the room, because we have dysfunctional families now in the state that run through those, and we think it's our typical, you know, Norman Rockwell type of visions that we see, and those aren't the families we're seeing in front of those, and they're difficult situations. But I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, we took an issue, and basically we just said we're going to reverse this. We're going to completely reform, start all over, basically, in terms of how we're going to deal with child abuse in the state. So I think the thing that people need to understand too is many of these issues take successive legislative sessions to really deal with some of the unintended consequences that a bill creates when it's first passed. You can't think through all of the various ramifications when we're dealing with policies such as CPS reform. But we'll look at data. We'll look at the information once we start getting things back. We've already seen some information saying, you know, we're reducing the recidivism as far as caseworker turnover. We're reducing some of the caseload work down from like 30 cases down to 18, 19 for each individual caseworker. But information from people like you and others that deal with this on a daily basis, that's what we're interested in hearing, and that's why we continue to come back and have meetings and talk to judges and talk to those people in CASA, other people that are working on these issues on a regular basis, and make sure that we go forward now into the next session with possibly additional legislation that may tweak or it may fine-tune what we did in the 85th, but that's kind of how we see this process working out.
Thank you.
So much.
A big problem, but a big problem to fix. So you foresee it being another, I guess, focus for the legislature in the coming session?
I mean, we will always be addressing certain things in the state: school finance, schools, education, CPS, water. Yes, sometimes there are bigger ones. I think last session we did the mountain work. Now we have to come back and refine it. And if we've, because we always will miss stuff. And technology changes, different things change, and we have to address for that too.
Yes, sir.
My name is Kenneth Aaron. I work here at HSU as a staff. I work in technology services. Both my wife and I are veterans, and we've used the local VA clinic here, and we've found it kind of, our experience somewhat poor. And this VA here has also failed my brother-in-law, which is very emotional for my family. But what can you do to improve the rural clinics, local VA clinics like this?
I think just making sure we understand exactly what you've experienced and understand where the difference is between federal obligations and state obligations. And so VA, as you know, is something that really starts at the federal level, but then we have responsibilities to make sure that those services and those programs are carried out at an effective and an efficient way. So we'd love to hear exactly what you've encountered, and my staff and I would be glad to listen and understand what the situation was and see what we can do to work on it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. The state did respond in light of in 2014 when we had all that scandal about the back wait times, addressing the strike force teams and things like that. So like you said, it's a delicate balance as far as finding where the state's role can help veterans in navigating that federal system. Right. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Robert Tucker. I'm the Dean of Fine Arts here at Hardin-Simmons. Appreciate you guys coming very much. Appreciate all the work that you do for the state. And I enjoyed your comments on ADA and education reform and all those things that will help us. We're often driven by our own personal situations and such as you with your wife. We have an autistic son who's now 28. It's come to my attention that Texas is pretty low in spending and helping those with disabilities, adults with disabilities in the state. There are some private efforts being made, but we're still pretty weak in our public transportation, employment possibilities, and general services. Our son has been on the Home Community Services list for, I think, 14 years now and still is not getting that kind of help. And we are able to help him. We're in a position for that, but there are many out there in Texas that are not getting those kind of benefits. I was wondering if you could address that. Thank you.
Sure, and I will say there has been some strong champions on autism in the House. My desk mate Ron Simmons has done an awful lot in that regards, probably more towards the youth aspect. Larry Gonzalez as well. I have had some of those challenges to where those services sometimes are available, but they're available in Dallas and Austin, and they're not available in Post or Nacona or wherever it is in my district. And you shouldn't be penalized based on where you live and being able to get to those. We did a lot with the CPS. I know there's also the adult side of things. This session, we've seen some turnover coming in from that aspect of workers leaving the adult side to say, well, now they're paying $10,000 more on the CPS side. I'll go over there. And so it is it is constantly, addressing where those shortfalls have come up, and the best way is to bring them to our attentions like this, so that when they do come back through, we can work to try to improve them. And I tell everybody, we will never be perfect as a state. If you want us to be perfect, utopia doesn't exist. We can always strive to do better, and we can be great, and we need to work towards that direction, though.
Our health reporter, Marissa Evans, wrote about that very issue, that you had a lot of people leaving. Do you think that the reduced turnover rates you've seen with CPS are because of the boosted pay?
I think it helped tremendously. I do think that. But we added 600 or 700 new caseworkers as well. So when you spread that out, certainly the metropolitan areas, the larger populated areas, probably where more of that funding went to help reduce some of that caseload and some of those percentages down. It kind of just really reemphasizes the differences that really we see more of are not so much ideology as they are geographic. And it's not an intended attack on rural Texas, but we continue to fight for education, healthcare, roads, and it's just that inertia that occurs when your population growth is in a certain area of the state. And so with redistricting coming up in a couple of more years, that's only going to be exacerbated. We know that the potential for us losing maybe one representative in rural Texas, in West Texas, could occur. So we've got to have a voice. We've got to make sure that our voice is being heard in a reasonable, pragmatic, common sense way of expressing, hey, we've got people living in the rural areas and they don't need to be driving 60 miles to get a driver's license renewed. They don't need to be driving 200 miles if they've got an autistic child or an adult in the family that needs services. So that's got to be the continued, just the dripping of the faucet. We've got to continue to make sure our voices are heard.
It's a perfect opportunity for us to plug our next event coming up on November 12th and 13th. The Texas Tribune is focusing on rural issues. We're having a 2-day symposium in College Station at AM University, so be sure to look for those details at texastribune.org. With that, we are out of time, but we covered a lot of issues, and we appreciate you guys coming out and appreciate you all coming out as well. Let's have a round of applause for our guest.